thank you everyone for coming on a Thursday afternoon, and thank you especially to the BACC team for inviting me to present my new book, which came out just a couple of months ago in London. But it's not English, it's Southeast Asian. It's the culmination of many years of my personal research as a researcher and a critic and a historian of art of Southeast Asia and as a curator. The book is somewhat unique in that it is a single author, big history of Southeast Asian contemporary art. So it starts as early as the 1970s, which many of the other types of books available at this time don't do. They typically start in the 90s, which is when global art, Southeast Asian contemporary art started to integrate the global circuit. And so typically other books look at that, or other books such as these on the screen, which of course inform my research. All the texts in these various books are important and are the framework, or somewhat the framework for what I do and then come out of. These other books, some of them are anthologies, meaning that they cover the various countries and the artworks of Southeast Asia singularly, meaning that, for example, one author will deal with Thai contemporary art and another author will deal with Indonesian and so forth. The book that I'm presenting now to you is essentially a cross look at all of Southeast Asian art, excluding two countries. So only Laos and Brunei are not covered in terms of the production of contemporary art in the region. And so the idea of the book was to not only make the point that as early as the 70s, artworks that we now today call contemporary were emerging, which somewhat goes against the, as I was saying earlier, the more common method, which is to look at the 70s onwards, but also to compare and contrast and to show, hopefully you'll be convinced by the end of our discussion, that there are definite and plural common threads across the region in the production of contemporary art, although the artists very frequently, particularly in the earlier periods, did not know each other. In other words, the argument I'm making is that a new language of art emerged in the 1970s, initially in very few places, initially with just a few artists. It was very patchy in the 70s and 80s, but that nevertheless, over time, that artists who did not know each other were making new types of art really in relation to what was going on. In other words, a new social art, a contemporary art very much informed by society and politics that were specific to the region. Ergo, the contemporary art that they produced is also specific to the region. And I make the argument that this is actually global art and important globally, that it should be considered. It deserves its definite place in global contemporary art history because it is doing something that others do not do. So today we're going to proceed. I'm going to try and keep it to under an hour to give plenty of time for Q&A. I'll talk a little bit just now briefly about the methodology of the book, how I proceeded. Then I'm going to do a very brief flashback to modern art, which is the earlier incarnation of Southeast Asian art. I'll discuss very briefly with a couple of examples what that is, and then why the contemporary is different. In what way, because there is this debate about modern contemporary, how they're connected, if they're connected. In my view, they are connected, but quite distinct, and so I will show you why they're distinct in a couple of slides. Then we'll go through a series of artworks, which all of them are in the book virtually, so they are already discussed in the book, but the idea here is not to mimic the book. The book is split into chapters that are temporal, so I do a very old-fashioned chronology of Southeast Asian contemporary from the 70s onwards, which then the chapters are split into sub-themes or sub-chapters, if you like. I don't do that in this way with this presentation because I just don't have enough time to mimic the book and go through everything. But we will look at a series of artworks, all of them important, I think, and seminal, meaning they're really part of the canon of Southeast Asian art history, if you believe in canons, which is itself somewhat debatable. And I have split those works into different approaches, showing you, again, the aim is always to show you across the countries and time that over 50 years and across the vast and very diverse region that is Southeast Asia, that nevertheless, despite these differences, despite Buddhism in Thailand and Christianity in the Philippines and Islam in Indonesia, despite economic differences, capitalism and communism in the various countries, despite some countries being much wealthier than others, that nevertheless artists are ultimately, as we see in the artworks, are driven to create the same sorts of languages, to deal with the same sorts of problems, issues. So, and then we'll conclude. So this is this is a slide which is essentially a composite of the earliest works of contemporary Southeast Asian art from the 70s and 80s. And as I said earlier, there were not that many artists engaging in this new type of art language in this period. But nevertheless, with the hindsight of history, and this is where a book like mine could be written today, but perhaps could not have been written 25 years ago, or certainly could not have been written even maybe 10 years ago, is that today we have enough work and we have enough hindsight, backward look, in order to start to see similarities, to discern common trends, patterns that emerge. So these are some of the works that are of the earliest period, and we'll talk about them in a minute. Let me just quickly evoke the methodology that I use, because typically every scholarly book is, in its first chapter, has to explain how you get to your conclusions. The idea is that the book will conclude with certain ideas, and therefore you have to explain how you got there. So my method was very simple. It was very old-fashioned art historical methodology, meaning I did visual analysis and contextual analysis on many artworks. So over 150 artworks from across Southeast Asia over a long period of time. So that's the basis of the conclusions that I draw. I chose works of a certain kind so that you will not see abstraction in this book. Okay, it's not a book about formalism. It's very much a book that shows that artists in Southeast Asia were very interested in aesthetics, but used aesthetic languages and other types of methods in new ways in order to achieve something. So in other words, you have to look at each artwork in order to be able to draw that conclusion. Few artists were dealing with these social issues initially in the 70s and 80s. We'll see that. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, I frame the book against the modern, which is what happened before the 70s and still is happening. So from the 70s, you have a concurrence between the contemporary and the modern in many places. I use Southeast Asian multidisciplinary research in order to frame the artwork. So in other words, I look across Southeast Asia at economics, at history, and at politics, and at general culture in order to understand the artworks, to read the artworks. So in other words, I'm not interested uniquely in form. I'm interested in what the artworks are striving to achieve, what they're trying to grapple with in terms of society and politics. And you can't do that unless you engage with the scholarship of history and economics and all those other things. Finally, I assume, this is an assumption, an important assumption, that the artists of Southeast Asia are primarily interested in what's going on at home. In other words, my fundamental assumption with this book, it's a decentered book, meaning for those of you who don't follow the discourses of art history, what I mean when I say decentered is that I'm looking at the artworks from the framework they were made in. I'm looking at them from Asia. I'm not trying to establish that artist X or artist Y were imitating artists in New York or Berlin. Now, I'm not deliberately negating that, but I'm essentially assuming that most artists, and this is true in Thailand or in Singapore or in the US or in the UK or anywhere, that most artists ultimately are making art dealing with what they are experiencing, not what other people are experiencing. And so that is a primary, it's an assumption of the book. And it's borne out. It's found to be correct. And finally, I'm using Elkins. Jim Elkins is an American researcher and theorist of art who, in the 2000s, essentially said, actually, we have different types of art histories around the globe, and some art histories seem to be more developed, some less developed. In fact, it's not that the art histories are more or less developed, it's just that the tools that we use in order to understand what's going on with the art are different according to different places. So I essentially use everything at my disposal to frame the artworks. In other words, newspaper clippings, exhibition catalogs, and multidisciplinary texts. That has not necessarily always been the case, particularly for modern art. And finally, I use Vietnam as a case study in my own research because Vietnam was, until the 90s, especially North Vietnam, was quite closed to outside influence. So if you can show that the Vietnamese, the contemporary artists of Vietnam in the early 90s did come up with a new language of art, and that the country was actually closed, that they could not have known very much about what was going on in New York, then you can actually say what I do say about the rest. In other words, it makes sense to think that most artists in Southeast Asia were using a similar approach. So let's look briefly back at the modern. The modern art came to Southeast Asia quite recently in most places, late 19th century for most parts of Southeast Asia, from Europe. Okay, this is undisputed. There's no discussion here. In Southeast Asia, oil on canvas was not something that was local. It had to be imported. Similarly, what was imported was the types of artworks that were being made from, let's say, the modern period in Europe onwards, such as still lifes, certain types of decorative portraiture, and landscape imagery. Of course, the Chinese traditionally had plenty of painting of landscapes, but let's leave the Chinese out of the equation. The Europeans brought their technology to Asia and Southeast Asia in the, let's say, the mid 19th century onwards. And the Southeast Asians adopt it, okay? John Clark, who's a famous historian of Asian art, modern art, has described the active transfer of the Asian artists in terms of how they adopted modern painting from overseas, from Europe. And what he means by active is that they essentially had agency over how they handled the foreign method, the foreign technology that was oil on canvas, and that they used it according to their own cultural interests, shall we say. So let's agree that that was the case. But what we can do is look at the artworks of the early 20th century, and this is true in Indonesia, in Thailand, in Singapore, not yet Singapore, in Vietnam, and discover that artists, the painters of Southeast Asia, who had just recently learned painting methods and painting technologies from Europe, keenly embraced one kind of painting over the rest, and that was life painting. In other words, they translated to a new technology something that had been in their culture for thousands of years, which was that material culture was always in Southeast Asia related to sacred and to secular rituals and to life in general. In other words, there was never anything like in Europe from the modern onwards, or even earlier, the Renaissance actually, where we start to see art for art's sake, art for the sake of decorating a room or something like that. In Asia, there was always aesthetics related to function, related to something sacred, related to something secular, but nevertheless still part of everyday life. So we see that the artists in the modern, even in the modern, are still deeply concerned with painting the everyday. Of course, there are plenty of exceptions, but I'm showing you these particular images to show that this was generally the case. We're pulling up in time now through the 20th century. These earlier images were from the earlier part of the century, and we draw up to post-colonial Southeast Asia. All the countries that I deal with in my book were colonized by the French, by the Dutch, etc., except Thailand, of course, which is never colonized, but nevertheless absorbed, particularly through Chulalongkorn at the beginning of the 20th century, absorbed a lot of Western culture. Western culture is not always negative. It can be to do with technology. It can be to do with certain types of technological progress. So I think we have to be a little bit less binary about East and West and the virtues or the disadvantages of Western knowledge and culture. These images on the screen are examples, 3 examples among many, of the kinds of painting that you see at mid-century thereabouts that are essentially celebrating the post-colonial era and the new nations of Southeast Asia, including Thailand, by the way, lower left, which was seeing a period of modernization and great optimism in this 1960s decade. But, in fact, even though those paintings were highly optimistic, there's a whole underbelly. There's something going on in Southeast Asia which is not optimistic, which is about violence, state violence notably, and many frictions of the social and political order. And this particular slide shows Indonesia in 1965, upper left. Then it shows the early Marcos dictatorship after 1972 with demonstrations and a lot of violence. Lower left are the race riots in Malaya, so 1969, and Thailand, 1976 Thammasat. So all these incidents within a very brief period, so we're talking a dozen years or so, demonstrate that the sunny outlook of the post-colonial years is actually not that sunny. So what does that mean in terms of art? It means that artists who are new citizens, right? These countries of Southeast Asia are new nations. That's a big thing. It's a thing that Europe experienced from the 19th century onwards, over many decades, that Southeast Asia experienced very, very briefly, very quickly, in a very condensed way over a few decades, after often very bloody wars of independence in Indonesia, in Burma especially. The artists are new citizens, but they don't want, some of them, to paint the kinds of scenes that we saw. They don't want to produce this. They want to use their art in ways that actually speak back to what is going on. Now, this is very few artists. Most artists enjoy and want to produce the kinds of sunny images that we saw in the previous slide, but a few do not. Not only are they keen to engage in what's going on, what affects everyone. Remember, art and life, that's a thing. It's a thing all around Southeast Asia. This is about life. This is about the other side of life. Not only are they interested to engage with those ideas, those realities, but also to bring their audience into these polemics, these tensions that are all around them. So how do they do that? And they want to do that without being censored, because the state is very powerful, whether it's Thailand or Singapore or Indonesia in the 60s and 70s, and up until today in most places. Typically, the cultural agenda is essentially set by the state, and it doesn't like artists talking back to power. In fact, that is true pretty much globally, I would say. But in Southeast Asia, there were some risks attached to making this kind of work. So here we have an artist from Malaysia and 2 from Indonesia. And there were not, as I said, and I repeat, not that many in the 70s who were answering power. But they did. And in this case, this work is directly related to the race riots in 1969. You can tell that by the title of the work. The work was made in 1970, but actually is about the race riots the previous year. The 2 second works, third and second, are to do with this Indonesian context. This one is talking back to the confrontation between modernity and poverty and not tradition so much, I guess to a certain extent tradition, and the confrontation between the West and Asia, in this case quite vividly demonstrated by these two images of Jakarta at the same time. Similarly, in the mid-60s, the Sukarno regime has just given way to the Suharto regime with great violence. Scholars suggest that some 1 million people were killed in the anti-leftist purges of 1965-1966 in Indonesia. And the Indonesian society was highly militarized. So what does Harsono do? In 1977, he produces a work that is both very provocative, but also very aesthetic. And this is the first example, I would say, of a string of artworks right up until today that juggle, negotiate aesthetics, classic aesthetics, everyday existence as a clue for people, and what is actually going on. So these are guns modeled after toy guns he found in the market. They're made of rice crackers. Rice crackers are part of the Indonesian staple diet. So anybody who would see this would think it a bit jokey and fun. It's pink, so it's not, it's very friendly, if you like. It's non-contentious. It doesn't look intimidating. It doesn't look like the artist is talking about the regime or talking about state violence. But the artist in this particular case does something very innovative. He uses the title of the work to draw in his audience and make the audience share the blame, if you like, or share the risk for answering back, for answering power back. And he asks in Bahasa Indonesia, at the time the title was not in English, what would you do if these were real pistols? So in other words, he's engaging with words. So already we see artworks that are multidisciplinary. He's using text. He's using the audience. He brings in the audience as a participant into the work. He's using aesthetics. This mound of pink guns is highly aesthetic. It's attractive. It's quite mesmerizing as an image. He uses all that to actually make his audience a very plural audience, not an elite audience, not people like us here today. We are all elites, okay? The common guy, to make people think about what it means to have a military government and to basically being subject to that on a daily basis. And the work, wouldn't you know it, is exemplar of Southeast Asian contemporary art in that it has traveled through time and place and would not be out of place today in the United States, which isn't run by a military regime, but nevertheless is swamped with guns and regularly experiences gun violence on a quotidian basis. So we see that these artworks that were made for an original time and place are sufficiently conceptual and sufficiently good-looking and interesting looking and have enough components in them to bring in multiple audiences that they transfer over time and place. And that is why I make the argument that this kind of art from Southeast Asia is global, should be global. In other words, it is a great art. It's a new art. It's highly innovative. I have not found anything in the books, Western art, that looks remotely like this. And it was made, I argue, and this is, again, one of the central key ideas of the book, is that all these artworks, and this one demonstrably, are made in relation to the context in which the artist was. So it's not an imitation. It comes out of the local directly. There are many artworks of this period that you have to go and find them because the vast majority were still lives, portraits, attractive landscapes of the rural Southeast Asia, but some were not. And this is an example, same period, so mid-70s, from a female artist in the Philippines. And here she's engaging with social exclusions based on class and based on skin color. So she's talking about social hierarchies in the Philippines, which until today are very, very strong. So the very white immigrant Spaniards are the top of the pyramid, and you go down right to the indigenous Filipinos, who were Malay, by the way, originally, and who are dark-skinned and often don't get educated and don't sort of are very much a subclass, etc. So she talks about this in these prints. Now, this would not have been very popular. This would not have been a topic that many patrons would have bought. But she nevertheless makes these attractive prints. She uses Tagalog writing in these prints. So she's, again, multimedia and multidisciplinary. She's integrating text into them. And oddly enough, these artworks actually did find an audience. They were sold. They were prints and they were sold. But obviously, the language of these works is very, very different to what you would have seen generally. Thailand, a little bit later, but barely. This is 1982. Chalud Nimsamar, who was a professor at Silpakorn for many years, and who made this somewhat one-off performative work in the countryside, very different to most of his oeuvre, which is essentially portraits of women and cats and sort of far more genteel images than this. He's here negotiating with animist culture, performing. So again, he didn't apparently have an audience for this except for the photographers. But nevertheless, we see he's very much iconoclastically diverging from the mainstream in Thailand at the time. And in the book, I devote a fair bit of analysis to this work, which I see as very much obliquely contesting the orthodoxy of Bangkok. The orthodoxy of Bangkok is a certain kind of art, often neo-traditional. Consensus art is the way that Apinan Poshiananda describes that kind of art, that he is not making with this. Consensus art being landscapes and images of idyllic villages and portraits and neo-traditional Buddhist types of imagery. He's revolting against that. He's rebelling against that. He was quite cryptic when I interviewed him about why, but he did it. And that's the point, is that he's searching for something that can actually talk to things that are going on in society. And there were plenty in the 70s, notably, so I'm sure he's aware of these things. He's talking back to a certain kind of reality with an art that is very different to the rest. Back to the Philippines, same idea. Here we're dealing with history. We note that some of these works are quite classic in terms of media. So I'm clear in the book that contemporary art in Southeast Asia is not about medium. It's about function. In other words, plenty of artists make paintings, they make prints, they make this kind of thing. This is just, I think it's pen and ink and gouache on paper. So you don't need to have video art or installation art or performance for it to be contemporary art. The point here is that the artist is probing the way history in the Philippines, notably colonial history, and what I was discussing earlier, these hierarchies, these social hierarchies, how they impact today, now, and what that means. So they're all about engaging you, the viewer, into thinking about critical ideas that you might not think about. So in that sense, they're a very new language of art, dealing with things that aren't typically dealt with in art. And Tang Da Wu in Singapore, here using vernacular, and I would note the word, he's using puppetry, which is a very old form of vernacular entertainment culture in all of Southeast Asia, in fact, all of Asia, which is still actually pervasive in some parts of rural Southeast Asia. Here he's talking about social issues in Singapore, which, believe me, in the late 80s, you could not talk about. This was not something that you typically, as an artist or anyone else, were welcome to talk about. In this case, a growing social hierarchy also in Singapore, whereby Singapore, which is increasingly wealthy, is starting to import foreign labor from the surrounding countries, in this case, Indonesian girls from the countryside, who very often had never been in high-rise buildings before and were instructed by their bosses to clean the outside of the windows of the high-rises, and sometimes fell and died from falling from a great height. That was a taboo topic. That was something that was only discussed in the Jakarta Globe, but not in the Singapore press, definitely not, because it didn't make Singapore look good, it didn't make the government look good. But nevertheless, Tang Da Wu used puppetry as a means of engaging real people, ordinary people with that topic. So, how then do artists expand the repertoire? This is the point in the discussion where I'm going to go through a series of slides quite quickly and not discuss them too much. We see first and foremost that artists start to think about how they are going to circulate their works of art. How do you talk to real people? Not in museums. First of all, the institutions of Southeast Asia at that point, museums for contemporary art, were barely existent, if at all. Second of all, even if they did exist, they typically were not interested in political art. As I said, the political art in Southeast Asia to this day is anathema, meaning it's not welcome for most institutional players. It's not something that the state particularly likes. It depends. All this is variable according to which country you're in. But certainly, for example, Vietnam is a good example. Communist Vietnam to this day would not accept any of the artworks that I'm showing you, even though they're part of the Vietnamese contemporary art canon. They are not, they would essentially not be shown in Vietnam in a public place. So artists think about where they can show their works such that they can provide access to their works. So they adopt, in many cases, public space. They hijack public space. They're not invited by anyone. They just do it. And sometimes they get caught and things don't go very well for them. So this is Tang Dawu, same artist as previously. In this case, making an artwork about the Vietnamese boat people who at that time were in camps in Singapore in the street. So he can be sure that he's addressing ordinary people, ordinary Singaporeans with this issue, which is, by the way, quite aesthetic, as you can see. And here he is asking people to get involved by making boats, paper boats. Most people can have that skill from childhood. So he pointedly involves common, ordinary people in his artwork as a means of engaging them on a topic. This is not something that artists do to be novel. They do it because it has a function. They can do it because, first and foremost, they will engage that general audience. But second of all, because in the culture, it's already there. So in other words, I think this is not conscious on their part, but as an art historian, you look at it sort of as a group thing. You look across the countries and you determine that many artists actually adopted this method of showing their works in public places. And I'm not, of course, because they want to access an ordinary public, but also within the culture, these forms of works were also familiar. And here's an example. This is Singapore, modern Singapore, a very modern, very rich Singapore. And I took these pictures less than 2 years ago. So in other words, in Singapore, to this day, people burn things ritually in the street, and many of the kinds of sacred and even secular things that are intrinsic to the culture, ingrained in the culture, not just, and these are people who are relatively young, so it's not just old fogies, it's everyone, do stuff in the public space. So in other words, that is part of an old cultural language that Southeast Asians have, and it's not that they resurrect it. They're not being nostalgic. They are using it because I theorize, that instinctively they understood that the people who would see these works would understand them. In other words, they were using known language by using the street. We're flip-flopping over time and over space, and this is Vasan Sitiget also engaging, a very young Vasan in 1993, engaging Bangkokians who refused to be interested, which I don't know if today that would be the case, but he's walking around in a somewhat Dada-esque pose with this boot on his head. This is still pre-constitution, so this is still militarized Thailand. Navin, another Thai, same story. In this case, he doesn't use the street, but he does use the Chiang Mai Public Library. So when I say public space, I mean spaces that are frequented by everyone. I also mean intellectual space, such as history. That's also a public space. Everyone owns history. Everyone is part of their national history. And we'll see it in the last part of the slides that artists are engaging history. So here's Li Wen doing the same thing. Here's someone else in Hanoi. And by the way, these works were often censored immediately. This work, which is to do with queer imagery, but also queer rights and the idea of wishing to humanize gayness, which was absolutely not acknowledged in Thailand, in Vietnam in the early 90s. This was taken down within about 50 minutes, under an hour. But he tried it. He put it up. It's what I would call guerrilla art. And the idea was to not put it up in a special elite gallery where 15 people would see it with their glass of champagne. No, this was about making sure that ordinary Vietnamese saw the work. Manit, 97, same thing, thinking about how you confront one kind of idea to the general population in the city, so using the city streets. Dinh Cule, same thing, using in this case a public market in Saigon in the late 90s to talk about Agent Orange. Agent Orange to this day is a huge taboo in Vietnam. No one wants to talk about it. It's, you'd think they would, but because of their relationship, their trade relationship with the States, they've always kept away from the topic. Dinh Cule raised the topic directly to his fellow Vietnamese by way of a stand in the market in Saigon by marketing these double Siamese twin baby clothes. One of the results, the physiological results of Agent Orange are these Siamese twins born. So children born with two heads and two arms, and as you can see, not something that is really pushed under the rug in Vietnam to this day. And Suti, Thailand's early 90s, one of the artists of the 90s who, with Manit and Vasan Sitiket and Navin and a few others, was really starting to think about history and public space in Thailand and how you engage the Thai population on their own history, taboo histories, by the way, and a work in public space. This work was up in the street in Bangkok, as you can see, opposite the Democracy Monument, and then went on to being shown many other places in many other contexts. Vietnamese artists, this time in the street, but in Cambodia, thinking about history again, but using public space, endlessly using public space. Myanmar, 2007, in this case, the Irrawaddy River, contesting the regime at that time, which was a military regime. Singapore, up very recently, so this is 2017, using an HDB staircase. HDB is public housing in Singapore, and this work was taken down within a day. It was deemed illegal and problematic, even though all she did was gild a staircase in an apartment block. But because it's public space, it did not fly. Same artist, same thing, public space. Renegade art, up for an hour or two and then taken down. This is an ironic look at nationalism. The city is another big topic. Urbanization, globalization, all those things are somewhat conflated in the minds of artists, and how Southeast Asia negotiates this very rapid urbanization, westernization, globalization of the 80s and 90s, and what that means. They're not interested per se in the city. They're not interested in saying the city is bad or the countryside is good. What they're interested in are the complicated implications of the confrontation between collectivist traditions and rurality, which are still pervasive in the 90s in Southeast Asia. The majority of Southeast Asians in the 90s still lived in the countryside, apart from Singapore. And so they're interested in the social repercussions of those things. And they're not telling you anything. None of these artists are telling you what to think or even giving you their opinion. This is not social realism. It's designed to make you think and come to your own conclusions. So we see a bunch of artists, namely in Thailand and in Vietnam, but there are others in Singapore as well, and in the Philippines. There's no space to look at them all, but a bunch of artists throughout Southeast Asia who are really considering this urban-rural friction or tradition-modernity confrontation. In fact, a show that Apinan Poshiananda did in 1996 in New York had that very title, tensions, traditions. So manifestly, people were thinking about these tensions, and the artists particularly. From Malaysia to Singapore to Vietnam, back to Thailand, and Thailand again. And when I said medium, the media are less important than the way the media work. And in this case, Nati, he's juxtaposing this image of a constable painting and very cleverly, I think, the rural idyll of the just industrializing UK, just industrializing West, and Constable's, a famous UK romantic painter, his look back at the countryside, even as all of Europe was industrializing and urbanizing, and how he's juxtaposed Bangkok into that. So it's a very convoluted, it's sort of an oblique way of making people think about what's going on in Thailand. And Vietnam, again. The Vietnamese probably experienced it the fastest. Within less than a decade, they had gone from extreme poverty and no electricity and no running water, even in Hanoi, to being a sort of middle income country. And Thailand again. Vernacular materials, artists throughout Asia, throughout Southeast Asia, as I said earlier, are keen to talk to ordinary people. How do you do that? You do that through materials, methods, iconographies that are familiar. And often the village provides that. Vernacular culture provides that. So we see Aramayani in 96 combining traditional Balinese dress and manifestly sort of toy science fiction type guns and sunglasses to talk about what's going on in Indonesia in the 90s. She's not preaching. And these images are all sometimes humorous, and they're always attractive. But they do have these elements that I call code, that are elements that are designed to be familiar to you such that you connect them to something else and then come up with a critical idea. You're doing the work. And in this case, this is Chan Lung talking about the same confrontation. This is the same idea as this image. Same thing. Rice, he's covered himself in it, and it's a dichotomy. It's this rice culture, but then it's also modernity, and what are we doing with that? Nindityo, Indonesia, same thing. Amanda, in this case, performative, but she's using this very typical family type preparing of vegetables together and drinking tea. A very sort of ordinary, mundane thing as a work of art in order to engage you about ideas of communication and miscommunication and hierarchy. We see that in Vietnam, still today, these are shots taken last year. Ceramics are still part of everyday culture, and wouldn't you know it, contemporary artists use ceramics, but to talk about things that are not typically on ceramics. Ceramics are usually very pretty and for your home, and they're inoffensive. This was a highly offensive, even though quite beautiful series of ceramics. Bui Kong Kang does the same thing. He uses ceramics, in this case, to talk about Chinese nationalism and the hostility that China has, its colonialism vis-a-vis Vietnam and the rest of the region. Harry Dono uses wayang, very traditional form, in this case to talk about the breakup of Indonesia that didn't happen in 2000. Restu, a young female artist from Jogja, so much different generation. These are artists who span many generations. They still go back to this vernacular culture. Sewn bullet works from the Philippines quite recently. And Jakai, who's sitting with us today, also using a series of signs, a series of references in this work, which is engaging something not very attractive, which is violence in the south of Thailand, but he's using sewing, he's using threading and embroidery, which is sort of a home crafty thing that every granny uses in Southeast Asia. So it's highly familiar. Gold, also highly familiar. So I'm using some of these images again to press the point. And spirit houses, also highly familiar, but in this case to talk about urbanization, modernity in Cambodia. Images of faith, very common in Southeast Asia, but not really to talk about faith, to talk about something else. In this case, to talk about what's going on in Thai Buddhism in 2000. I'll leave that to your imagination. This is a very well-known image. Another seemingly something about, is this a celebration of Buddhism? Not really. If you see the medium, he's used money in order to dissect, to cut apart the walking Ayutthaya Buddha. Hoi Chong from Malaysia, in this case, has put a minaret on a Chinese building. So what is he talking about? He's actually talking about Islam in China. We all know the fate of the Uyghurs in China today. It's only gotten worse, but it was already not looking good in 2005. Same again, in this case, a somewhat spiritual looking thing. This is using rituals that could be about, could come from the ritual repertoire, but don't. In this case, this is deeply political, but on the surface, it doesn't look political. Dharma, again, violence, breakage, so many things. You're using religion, you're using imagery from religion, you're using imagery and methods from religion, practices from religion to talk about something else. Penury, again, she mixes up stupas and breasts. This is not a overtly social work, but nevertheless, my reading of the work with these three colors is to do with skin color and I think something to do with interracial harmony and that kind of idea, and using people to throw themselves into the cushions. So a dynamic work that does make you think about stuff. It's not just about fun and games. More religious type images, faith images, but in this case to do with the Saffron Revolution, which occurred in Myanmar in 2007, which was the beginning of getting rid of the military, but unfortunately it didn't last very long. Cambodia, imagery that looks ritualistic, but actually has double meanings to do with, in this case, the sell-off of Cambodia to multinationals and corruption in Cambodia. And in this image, to do with the increasing intolerance in Indonesia of Sufi Islam and the variations, the hybrid Muslim Islams of Indonesia. Okay, the last section, and then we will conclude, is to do with history and how artists are using histories, plural, of their nations, national histories that are typically the histories given to them, that are the accounts that are given to us by the state, and how artists are often contesting, but in a subtle way, these narratives of history, these monoliths of history that often do not necessarily include real events that occurred, but that the state would rather repress. We've seen this image before. This is an image also that from Vasan Sitiget from Thailand, who produced a series of 20 pictures purely related to the 1976 Thammasat massacre, which in 76, virtually from 76 to the late 90s, no one really talked about this in the Thai history books, the official books, I should say. So in 76, he fast forwards to 96, so that's the 20th anniversary of Thammasat, and he makes a series based on the events, but with changes to the original press photographs of the event, such that he brings the Thai population, who are quite oblivious, it seems, in 96 to these events, and makes them think about them, and makes them think about what it means to neglect history. So in other words, the work can be read as a memorial to Thammasat, which on one level it could be, but to me, more important is perhaps the idea that he is using the Thammasat massacre as a means of saying, do not forget, and if we do forget, we are going to recreate the kinds of violence that we have seen in the past. So it's a kind of philosophical way of dealing with a tragic, traumatic incident of violence. Li Wen in Singapore, thinking about Singapore history and how certain strata of the Singapore population have actually been removed from the history of Singapore quite conveniently. So this work is about that. Suti's work, we've seen it a few slides ago. In this case, we see that he's also interested in Thammasat with this work, and very cleverly the artwork resurrects Thammasat for people by the way of rubbing. So in other words, he, like Harsono in 1977, he brings the audience into thinking about what it means to obliviate history, and how we can recreate, we can get agency over our own history by actually making these rubbings of events that he's engraved on the desktops. Dinh Khulé does something similar with the Cambodian genocide of the mid-70s. And Manit very famously, again, uses several, in this case, several incidents of state violence in Thailand, Thammasat, but also 1973 and 1992 in his series Horror in Pink, by injecting Pink Man into the series. And Chan Long in Cambodia, same idea. This is about Vietnamese, Cambodian history. Indonesia, in this case, Malaysia, thinking about the original social partition of Malaysia after race riots in 1969, whereby the Malay majority essentially eclipsed the Chinese minority. In other words, the Malaysians enacted Bumiputra, which were racial laws favoring the Malay Muslim majority over the Chinese minority. So it's a work about that. The Filipinos do the same. Ilan in Malaysia does the same. And all these works, you see different media, different forms, different episodes of specific histories. In this case, we're dealing with the immolation, the self-immolation of a Buddhist monk in 1963. So very specific things that only a few would know about, even in Vietnam today. But the way he's dealt with incongruence of the baseball bat, which is quintessentially American, and then these images of this immolated monk, beautifully carved, so still this vernacular craft. Many of these artworks include all these strategies for making you, the viewer, think about the implications of these types of histories. So we see artists from different generations still adopting the same types of strategies across Southeast Asia. And in this case, a series of artists who are plucking totems of the state. So they're actually using money, which is obviously produced by the state, stamps, flags, maps, anthems, money again, to make works that are often subversive. This is a highly subversive work. This is an artwork where the artist has reimagined a group of leftists who were jailed by Lee Kuan Yew in the early 60s, how he's imagined them as as mascots of the state. So instead of having they were jailed, in real life they were jailed for many years. These were a group of leftist students in the Cold War 60s, when everyone who wasn't left in Southeast Asia was very right. In this case, Singapore was very anti-left, anti-communist, and so these kids who were just university students who had a leftist association were jailed, and how this artist is imagining Singapore had these people not been jailed, and how Singapore would have been had the left actually not been completely repressed in the early 60s. So very contentious artwork. I showed it in 2010 in Singapore, and there were some issues about it. It wasn't censored, but it could have been, I guess. Indonesia, more symbols of state, the passport, and how she gives people agency to create their own passport from their own place. The military here confronted with the Sangha this is in Burma, but made by a Vietnamese artist. And again, this same work that we saw earlier, Jack Hai's work, but in this case, using the military jacket, which is, of course, part of the state, a state totem, a state emblem. And last but not least, before we conclude, flags. And this work, subversive. This lasted all of an hour on Singapore. This was put up on an HDB. Singaporeans, for those of you who don't know Singapore, we have a national holiday in August which celebrates big on nationalism, and typically we're all supposed to put up the flag a good month before the holiday, and some people keep it up a month after. So the artist is playing around with the meaning of nationalism and the insidious aspects of nationalism, because nationalism is often used as a means of splitting the population or of deciding who is in, who is out, and it's a tool of power. And we see that, I guess, in some countries today, particularly where nationalism is used as a means of power. So it's even though the countries of Southeast Asia that had been colonized fought for their nations, we see how the nation didn't turn out the way the citizens would have wanted in many cases. So these artists are using the symbols of state to address that. So, on that note, we have finished our very brief tour of the images of Southeast Asia, and there are many, many more that I could have shown you, but no time. So we see that there is a kind of 20, 25-year staggered chronology for the beginning of Southeast Asian contemporary art. In some places, Indonesia, artists start to use these new languages, these new visual tools and codes and modes of circulation earlier, but that by the 90s, virtually everywhere, Cambodia and Myanmar a little bit later, but barely, have also begun to see that art can be a tool, can be a voice for speaking back to power. The why, the what, the how we've explored. The why is because art and culture were always linked in Southeast Asia. There's no reason for modern artists and the contemporary artists to disjoin, to distance art and life. Quite the contrary. They see that modern painting, as it's taught in the art schools of Southeast Asia, is not adequate for dealing with social and political tensions that erupt around Southeast Asia in the 70s onwards. This is the height of the Cold War. And when, at a time where the new nations of Southeast Asia had been created with a great deal of optimism, but that the citizens of these new nations were not getting the kinds of rights that they had been told they would get. In other words, they had battled the colonial monster and booted out the imperialists, but then they did not have agency. They were not able to vote in the kinds of people that they necessarily wanted, that there was still, they still had no or relatively little power. So this is the why. And the what is that they want to engage real people. They are interested to use art as a means of talking to their fellow citizens. And they're not activists. None of these artists, by the way, are traditional Western political artists. There's a big difference. These artists, as we've seen, have all produced highly aesthetic artworks, meaning artworks that are good-looking, that are compelling visually on many levels, sensorially, whether you can touch them, look at them, hear them. They all have characteristics that I would call classically part of the classic aesthetic repertoire, global, if you like. And there's a reason for that. It's that aesthetics and culture were always put together in Southeast Asia. There's no reason for these artists to rebel against aesthetics. They do not need to rebel against 600 years of Western art because they didn't have Western art for 600 years. It's only recent. Moreover, I think, my research has shown me, and I've corroborated this with interviews, artists in the region often think that aesthetics are useful. In other words, that something that looks good is attractive and will pull the viewer in. And then that's when they can start building their discussion, their exchange, their dialogue with the viewer about important issues. How? Well, we've seen how they use the street, they use collective space, they use new modes of circulation by asking the viewers to engage, as Harsono did in 77. He asks a question in the title of the work. You cannot escape that question. If you don't read the title of the work, the work is incomplete. You need to respond. You need to write your answer down in the book. Similarly, with Suti's history class of 2000, you have to sit down and make a rubbing. So these are new modes. These are artists being highly inventive about how they can actually bring you, the viewer, into these discussions. But they are using aesthetics, media, form, everyday objects, and they don't have any limit in terms of the kinds of appropriations and signs that they borrow from every register, low and high art, to do that. And they bypass censorship. They manage to build these artworks without getting stopped by the authorities. And they do that, I think, through visuals, through aesthetics, but also because they're indirect in what they're saying. They're not actually saying anything. They're asking you to figure it out. So this is why I say it's a new methodology, a new visual language, because they need to do something that artists in the West did not need to do. There was no reason for artists in the West to be so elusive, to be so indirect, because there was no censorship of political art in the West. You did not go to jail because you produced an anti-war something during the Vietnam War in 1968, New York. Okay, whereas these guys, if they had been deliberately let's say anti-army, anti-military in Suharto's Indonesia in 95, let's say, there was a fair chance you would be at least called in for questioning, and if not, maybe worse. So they needed to invent new strategies of visuality whereby they could talk to their audience, but somehow camouflage the real topics of their artworks. So there were new needs, so they made new kinds of works. And the context is everything. In other words, these works are all deeply contextual. They all revolve around what's going on here and now. They're not interested in looking at artworks elsewhere. So it's because of this analysis of each of these artworks that I'm able to conclude that these artists really did invent something new because of the situation, the circumstances of Southeast Asia in the mid to late Cold War period that were also new, unprecedented. New circumstances, new language of art. And I finish with this idea that this new language of art that emerged in the 70s in Southeast Asia is in our 21st century a highly relevant language of art globally. In other words, what the Southeast Asian artists were obliged to invent 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago, is now, wouldn't you know it, necessary in many parts of the world, because we are backsliding. Democracy is backsliding in many places where everyone would have thought certain places in the world were built on democracy, but actually now they're backsliding across all the continents. And it seems that art may well be the final bulwark against certain kinds of overreach of the state in various places. So I think that artists throughout the world would have a lot to learn from Southeast Asian artists. And on that note, I will just finish by saying, last point, Magicien de la Terre, for the art history wonks here who know what that is. That was a big exhibition done in Paris in 1989 at the Pompidou. And it was designed to bring global art onto the world stage. And essentially, it made the case that, guess what, art history is global. But I would counter, and I have countered today with slides, namely those showing that the contemporary art of Southeast Asia goes way back to the 70s, that even though the West became aware, people in Paris became aware, wonderful, of contemporary art everywhere in 1989, that they were about 2 decades late. Thank you. So questions, and then we'll take a break and have our panel, which will focus on Thai art. I'm fine. That's it? Thanks for coming. Thanks for lending us your work. Oh, Someone with a mic. There's, yeah, okay. Tell me, Pat.
Junction that you were talking about Thailand and Vietnam and Cambodia, but how about that angle also?
Laos. Yeah.
Yeah.
There thanks, Pat, for the question. So there are three countries excluded from my study.
Excluded.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. One is Laos, one is Brunei, and one is Timor-Leste, which is a new member of Southeast Asia, right? Where it used to be 10 and now we're 11, theoretically. I think Timor-Leste counts as 11. The reason I left out Laos, which is a much bigger country, Brunei we can understand, there just isn't very much contemporary art. Laos is the same. There just wasn't enough contemporary art in Laos. Modern art there is, but not contemporary art of this type of work that I've been showing you, which is using multiple signs from the culture and beyond to talk directly to audiences about society and politics. Currently there are, just very recently, but not enough that I stop at 2020. The books, and most of the study that I do in the book is really at the beginning and in the 90s, where I'm starting to show these very, very strong patterns emerging of certain topics that artists are interested in, but more than topics, that the methodologies of art making are similar across the way, even though they don't know each other, and are different, distinctive to the region. So Laos, I think, maybe as of 2015, 16, there are a couple of artists who are the same people, by the way, in all the biennales. It's always the same two people, are making works that are, people slot them into the biennales and call them contemporary art. I'm not even 100% sure that they would be by our traditional definitions. And by the way, just as an aside, the definition that I use for contemporary art in Southeast Asia, I take out of Terry Smith. So, and he's very vague, and that's very helpful for us, because the vaguer it is, the easier it is for us to slot pretty much what we want into the box. But for me, the definition of contemporary art is art that is trying to pull normal people into a discussion about contentious stuff that's going on. So I think the Laotians, there are a couple, I think, coming up, but not enough that I can feel comfortable including them. As an art historian, you need enough stuff in order to make a point that ultimately is a bit reductive. Does that make sense? Yeah, I mean, even Sopip, you notice that I didn't include him. Yeah, you want to know why? Okay, so Sopip definitely uses vernacular materials, but to me, he's more of a formalist. I do mention him in the book, and there's only one work that I mention in the book, and that's the work that's I think it's in the Met in New York, and it's a Buddha that's it's a rattan Buddha that's sort of distressed, and to me, that's the only work that he's made that would qualify my definition, because he is, with the blowing up of the image of the Buddha, he's critiquing, I don't think he's critiquing Buddhism, I think he's critiquing the current state of play in Cambodia via Buddhism, which is the state religion and effectively what everyone does. So it's a very oblique way. But even then, I think I'm maybe pushing the envelope. The majority of the works that he is making are formalists. They really are. He's not concerned with politics or society. He may tell you he is, but the works don't reveal that. So, and this, as I said, this is really specific. Power, politics, and the street. I'm clear about that. I don't include other artists. There are plenty of artists who may think that they should have been in the book. I'm sure I'll be hearing from them and others. And there are plenty of artists in the book who no one has ever heard of. So conversely, right, because there are artists who, Vietnam notably, where they've been really censored and kept out of the official art histories of Vietnam. And yet and yet you see the works are really powerful and great and do all the things that others do. So, yeah. Okay.
Hello. My name is Manit. I'm from Myanmar. I started as a civil engineer who interested in architecture, but now I get into MFA in civil. And actually, like, even though I didn't intend, but my recent exhibition come up like that, like through Bengal Design Week as a student project, like arts and J, people in prison, are we in self-prison? But intention is to realize like self-awareness and self-reflection. But J represent many things, like, you know, and also people from Myanmar can see, like, you know, and also other country who has suffered so much oppression can see what J is. And the point I want to mention is like you also mentioned like invasive, elusive strategies, but how we can develop those and also keep our art survive, keep ourselves survive, even though we're getting into it. And also another thing is like how we can become, you know, an anonymous or some kinds of unknown artists, even though we can bring us so much meaningful, you know, or powerful art to people. Because artists need reputations, and I accept that, but sometimes it can harm to our families or other who belong or live in the country. But how we can, you know, evolve in such situation? Because I feel like we also have to keep doing and keep going, but we need something to cover up, like some layers to protect ourselves.
Yeah, I could have shown works by Chen Lin and others, of course. And you're right about jail, and Myanmar is a particular case in point. I think the answer to the first part of the question is how do you do work that's elusive but still remain somehow true to the violence? And I think many of these works, I probably didn't get into it sufficiently, but the book does, are a strange and new, innovative mixture of very elusive and quite literal. I'll take the example of Vasant Sidiket's Blue October, that series of 20 paintings, which are very literal. They're literal because they appropriate the newspaper images shot by the press, the Western press, of Thammasat. So they are a literal representation of the massacre. But at the same time, he does stuff to those images. First of all, he gets rid of the background. Second of all, he makes them duochrome. So he uses only blue, white, and black. So that's also an aesthetic change that sort of clues you into a certain way, a connection that isn't literal. Then he opposes gold badges onto the images as a sign of merit, but only on the victims, not on the perpetrators. So again, is that literal or is that conceptual? It's a good point, right? So I think the artists are very often, and it's not that there's a textbook for this. There is no guide. There's no style guide. There's no instruction manual. But instinctively, seemingly, or in some cases, I think probably intellectually, they're balancing out things that are very literal and very dark, very violent, and things that are not. And I think maybe the comfort comes from both sides of those things. But for sure, censorship is part of the equation. You cannot be too literal. Because in the Philippines is an exception. Let me give you an example. In the Philippines, social realism always had a strong representation from the late 19th century onwards. And right up into the 90s, the Filipinos made social realist images of poverty in the Philippines. So there's no illusion there. There's no connections. It's a straight up image showing you violence, death, and poverty. So, but they weren't censored. I guess the Filipinos never seem to have a problem with that because, I don't know, maybe because of religion, maybe because of Catholicism and the fact that that is part of Catholic cultures that you display, that kind of thing. So they didn't need to be elusive. And I guess they found their own personal pathos with that kind of image. the second part of your question is more complicated. I'm not sure I have an answer for that. I think each artist is different and how they negotiate that being true to yourself and being an artist. So I don't think I can answer that question, that part of the question.
Sometimes it's like, quite draining, like suffering, like being artist becoming more emotional, but like so those, scenes or things in the mind like keep draining. But yeah, I feel like we need to keep carrying on because like, it gives meaning to people in different way, maybe get some escape, but we also, have to keep ourselves. So thank you so much for your
pleasure. One last point I would like to say is that artists are very important. And it is exactly if you think about the intellectual class in Asia, being a writer is maybe more difficult because you need to write what's going on. The artist has that creativity, that inventiveness, and the language of the ability to do different things with image and language that I think is very important. And I do think that artists in Southeast Asia play this role. So yeah, you can be emotional and be sad personally, but I always think that the artists seem to be the ones, not less the writers, who are feel like they have a responsibility to the people and are pushing forward and taking those risks. And I think this is why the art is so great, is because you see that in the art, you sense that, the risk-taking. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Paco Arragan. I'm a curator from Spain. A couple of weeks ago, I attended C-Focus in Singapore, the art fair.
Yes.
And there was a very interesting panel about the articulation of modernity versus contemporaneity. And while the speakers were talking, in my mind, all the time, all these concepts were coming up, coined by Western intellectuals.
Mm-hmm.
Hans Belting, global art, Maria Lind, the curatorial, Terry Smith, you just quoted the contemporary. So the question will be, in how far can it be problematic that in other regions they try to articulate their own discourse about modernity versus contemporaneity in terms that has been clearly set by Western intellectuals. And that don't really have much to do with the proper context.
Yeah, that's a key thing. And that's why I ended with Magicien, that reference to Magicien de la Terre from 89. My research and what I've been doing in Asia for over 30 years is embedded in Asia. And from the beginning, it seemed to me, arriving from London in the 90s, that the Southeast Asian artists that I was encountering had a language of art that I couldn't frame from a Western perspective, nor did I want to. So I would say at this point, and I think it's in one of my slides, that I am not only decentered, meaning I'm Hans Belting and all the, whether you're using Deleuze or whomever it is you're using, maybe apply, maybe are useful, but we have to remember that art comes before the theory of art. Art comes before the history of art. Art comes before the criticism of art. So when I teach, and I teach art history in Singapore, I teach contemporary art history, I also teach curation. I teach art history from the art. I start with the art. And so it's not just that it's problematic to apply these different people. I don't mind doing it, but it seems to me that it's not, neither is it useful nor is it necessary. So I think it's a conceit of the art historians who studied mostly in the West, let's face it, that they want to fit in these people into these discourses that they have studied, and they will do their best to fit in these people. But I actually think, as we saw in the 70s, the artists of Southeast Asia were breaking free of their own modern, and John Clark makes the point that modern painting in Southeast Asia is already its own man, if you like, or its own woman, its own agent, that there is this active transfer whereby the local artists took on what they wanted and not everything. But already in the 70s, we see people like Harsono and Kahipe and Daya and so forth, concerned with dealing with the contemporary, and therefore, of course, the art has to be the guide. And I honestly, the kinds of texts that some of my students like to use, I look at the citation and I think this is completely irrelevant. They've just brought it up to show me that they have read this text, but it's actually not linked to the artwork. So ultimately, art history is about the art. So let's start with the art, and let's try and not be lazy. And as people in Asia, and I'm not Asian, but I am a historian of Asia, let's build an art history from the art, from the Asian art, and by the way, from Asian culture and history, which is hardly impoverished. Asia has had high culture for 5,000 years. So there's no real reason to be using Western intellectual discourse unless you need it, unless it's useful. So test it first would be my answer.
As a last comment, I would say that I don't know the art of this region very well, but for me, it has a lot of similarities with art in Latin America.
Yes.
And also from a historical, economic, political perspective, the same dictatorships, whatever, you know. So.
Sure.
But thank you for the fruitful exchange.
Yeah, on that comment, just to say, there was an exhibition done in 1999 in New York, I think in the Brooklyn Museum, called Global Conceptualisms. And the majority of the works in that show were from Latin America. But there were also works from Southeast Asia. So yeah, there are definite, I think we could do a lot more in terms of research and doing cross-national comparisons. Yeah, but it won't be me, but it might be someone else, one of my students maybe. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you very much for the interesting talk. I'm Freda, and I'm a researcher and freelance curator, mostly going back and forth between Taipei and Vienna. And I was kind of thinking about this term performance art, also because you've brought up some examples of Li Wen's work, Xingwei Issue in Chinese, that many of the works kind of from the time periods that you're referencing actually sort of intersect with this performance art discourse, at least in its kind of connection to the question that just came before, Western sort of framing. Would you want to say or comment on whether that was a term that was in a way relevant to the examples that you looked at, since they deal so much with public space and its sort of bodily enactment?
Sure. I actually 2 weeks ago was somewhere else and gave a talk about not just performance art in Southeast Asia, but performativity. And to me, the first performative works were in the 70s, even though they were installation works. I actually don't talk about participatory art, I talk about participative art, so as a means of distinguish it from the Western ways of framing it, even though there's plenty of crossover. To me, the performative aspect of these works comes from necessity and from the culture. So I really don't see the same genealogy at all. Happenings of the New York type, 60s art, a few artists, and I've interviewed many of them, were vaguely aware of them, but not, interestingly enough, not the early guys. The later guys were. So there's plenty of similarity, but I think the differences are perhaps more interesting. And one of the differences is that performance art in Southeast Asia was cheap and elusive, meaning you could wrap it up and not go to jail. There was no evidence. And that's very different to the genealogy of performance in 60s New York. And so, again, one can use the text that, and of course, the West has the monopoly on the writing, there's no question, and the West has the monopoly on the labels. So I always say to the students, there's a label and then there's the thing. And it's not because you've come up with a label that the thing didn't previously exist. So it's a question of knowing where to look for it. So I think it's a very interesting thing, and I think a lot more research needs to be done to disentangle and also show the similarities. Because of course, in the West, happenings came in part as a means of rebelling against the institution and against the kinds of, the institutionalization of art as it was in the 50s and 60s in the West. Remember that in Southeast Asia, there were no institutions. We're not rebelling against any kind of institution. There simply were none. It's not the same, doesn't come from the same place. So even though formally they may resemble one another in terms of actions, and of course the human body ultimately is universal, right? So there's the appeal, there's the quintessential visceral interest of the human body in space. And that is East or West, it doesn't make any difference. But in terms of the usage of space in Southeast Asia, I think there's a real difference. Now, Li Wen is a special case because Yellow Man was actually birthed in the West. He first made Yellow Man in London. He first produced Yellow Man in London as his means of commenting racism and the ignorance of the British public in terms of understanding what an Asian was. So it was a self-reflexive work looking at himself, as it were. So somewhat autobiographical and thinking about what it meant to be Chinese or Singaporean, because they're not the same, and looking at himself from inside and outside himself, which is, by the way, a methodology that these Southeast Asians use all the time. There's this inside-outside way of looking at everything, which arguably maybe comes from colonialism or from diasporic history. A lot of these guys the whole of Southeast Asia is hybrid and a place of migration always. So whether those things are connected, I don't know. That's, again, a research paper to be written. But so Li Wen is a little bit of an exception in relation to the question, I would say. But generally speaking, I think it's not devoid of interest to look at the Western text, but I do think from the outset you have to distinguish. But and especially because so many of the physical works are initially performative. So in other words, it's not that performance just arrives. It actually is birthed over this period of 20 years or so where artists are already figuring out how they want the audience to come into play. And, does that answer someone?
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, my name is Nicholas, and sorry. Here, sorry.
Yes.
My name is Nicholas. I'm a researcher from Germany. I'm very new to the field, so I hope this is a valid question. I was just curious. We talked a lot about elusiveness of the art, and I'm just interested in how can you assess the actual impact of the art that is understood in accordance with the intention of the artist, and how can you say that?
Yeah, the empirical evidence thing is tricky. It's actually one of the toughest things. Do these artworks actually work? They're designed. The intention is one thing. I'll give you an example of some artworks that I think have worked. And I showed you 3 series of Thai art works, one by Manit, one by Vasan, and one by Suti. And the 3 works dealt with one incident in Thai recent political history, which is a massacre that occurred on a campus in Bangkok in 1976. And I mentioned, I think, that incident has been fairly muffled since its occurrence in 1976. And the 3 works in question were made in 1996, in 2000, and in 2001. And more recently, that incident has started to be discussed historically and has become less taboo. So I'm prone, as I would be, to think, to hope, to assume that those artworks played a role somehow in altering the public discourse around that extremely taboo incident. It's impossible to prove, frankly, and I think none of this, I have tried sometimes to connect the desired outcome of these works and actual reality. It's very difficult to prove, but I think so. Art matters a lot. Visual culture matters a lot to people everywhere. And I think so long as these works could be disseminated, people could somehow see them. They must have worked at least on a few people in that respect. So yeah, it's the weak point. It's the vulnerability of the argument is how functional were these pieces.
Thank you.
Yep. And Luckana Kunavichayanont, who is a curator, arts administrator, researcher, what other titles? Many, yeah, and who's been involved with many of the biggest Thai art projects over the last 20, 30 years, and who knows the art world in Thailand inside out and is part of shaping that art world. So maybe we should ask Manit, how come his works travel so well, even though they're dealing with very specific and not necessarily attractive moments in Thai political history?
I think actually you already, I thought your lecture is already finished. you don't need this, session. But anyway, answer your question is quite difficult for me to. I'm not the person to answer it. It should be you and a curator, because my work, particularly this series, been travel in many continents. Let's say, from Asia to Europe to Latin America. I don't know, maybe, violence is everywhere in this world. So no matter whether your country is rule democracy or dictator by dictator, whatever, they always, because we're dealing about the power, and the power is always, people who in the power that never let go their power. They don't want to share the power to the people. That's why people always suffering. And I think this is very common, something that they, my work may probably, dealing about that and sharing that kind of suffering. And that is maybe that the reason why the work is quite, relevant to, let's say, many people in this world.
I just like to continue from the last questions or the last comment about performative aspect in the contemporary art in Thailand, because when I saw this work, I just also thought about Tang Chang's work, because it's, it has this certain performative aspect in the work. And also when you trying to trace back when is the performative work has been introduced or actually been kind of like practiced in Thailand, in a way it's not that really purely performative as it is, but it's kind of like combining with the paintings or some other mediums, like in the case of Tang Zhang, when he combining the form of performance within the painting as the meaning of kind of like expressing political protests against what is really happening during that 1970s up to the early 1980s, whereby, you know, in one of his paintings, he's kind of like taking out one of the eyes and then cutting the hands. And, you know, within that painting and with some of the choreography, the Chinese choreography, putting in the painting. So when you see the painting, you see the actions, the real actions of the artist doing all this, you know, expressive kind of like performance, taking the eyes out, cutting off the hands, you know, in a sort of violence way, while he kind of like applying on, you know, the oils and other, you know, features on the canvas. So in a way, I think in Asia, it has been like that since the beginning, combining these many different aspects of expressions, performatives in a way. So it has been, I would say, like the other way around, that we have been contemporary or post-modern since the beginning. And, you know, when we talk about like learning the theory of modernism and things, it's just come later when artists starting to apply the modern theory into their practice. So it's like another way around. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And so the key then is within the education system, the art education system in Thailand, is to recognize that there are already elements in the culture that are innate in Asia, but would be new in a Western context. And instead of trying to pretend they don't exist, and to, in fact, recognize them and research them and see how, you mentioned Tang Chang, who was a self-taught artist. And that's a key element. He was never infected by, so those of you, I'm not sure the reference to Tang Chang, does everyone know who Tang Chang is? He's maybe not. A modernist Thai painter, self-taught, but Sino-Thai. So already he has a double culture. And an intellectual, a Buddhist, profoundly spiritual artist who never sold his works, it seems, and who used painting and drawing as a form of spiritual healing and somewhat, yes, I mean, it was, did he meditate? He's somewhat meditative in his practice. And so I think that's what you're referencing when you say the performativity of the action of the art making. But even if you go back beyond Tang Chang and modern painting in Thailand, you find that in everyone's culture, there's this mix, multidisciplinarity is this word of the postmodern in the West. But in fact, traditionally, everyone was pluridisciplinary across Southeast Asia. It was quite normal in all kinds of, in vernacular culture to just integrate speech and movement and image making. And it was all somewhat unpremeditated, unscripted, and also that people would join in quite naturally, organically. So I think what you're describing is the state of affairs in Thailand. So how is it, if we're talking about this topic of crossing borders, so you're suggesting then that crosses borders as a form because it is now it's contemporary in the West, whereas it was always being done in Asia. Yeah? I mean, do you think that's, as an artist, would you think that bears out? Is that the case?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know what to say.
All right, end of session.
Yeah.
Questions?
I just thought about this because thinking about Ruklit Tirawanit, relational
yes.
aesthetic works when he starting to invite people to come and drinks together, eat together, and he just cook, and serve food for free to the people in New York City, in apartment. And I think that was like 1980s, late 80s, and he keep doing that like in many events until up to 2000, early 2000s. That is really like something very special in New York or in the Western, countries. But back here, who cares? Because you serve food everywhere. I mean, like we always like gather together and just eat together. So and people will start doubting, it is really art? That is, what the artists do. So, it's I think this is like what,
Okay.
yeah.
So I would pick up and say that is very much, but he did that, but with a very Western lens. In other words, he was trying to find a new language of art for the sake of finding a new language of art. Whereas his compatriots back in Thailand, who actually did have something to talk about, which was the military, which was in power in Thailand until 1994, and other issues, many other kinds of social issues, didn't look for a new form of a new language of art as a means of finding a new language of art, but as a means of talking about new stuff that needed to be talked about. So I think he is, to a certain extent, Rikrit arguably exoticized Thai culture in New York, and therefore developed something that the Bourriot thought was extremely new, great, but in terms of theme, in terms of content, it has no content except for form. It's form. It's pure form. And so when we say that Asians always mixed art and life, in other words, he was only taking one part of that, which was just general life. But there's no addition. Whereas these other guys were mixing art and life, and they added something. They gave it some extra substance. So maybe Rikrit was ahead in terms of the West, but maybe a little bit behind in terms of the rest of the Asians. I don't know. I should not be cited saying that, but
I think we came to the point that people have different definition about art. For instance, I talking about the work with Pad Thai. I remember that back in 20 years ago, when he came back to Thailand, and I think people start questioning, just cooking Pad Thai in a gallery is an art. And Chalerm Chai, Kosipipat, he is, very good painter. He built the temple in Chiang Rai, if you know that, the White Temple. And he have a question. He said, if Rikrit can be an artist, what about a lady sell Pad Thai on the street? Is she an artist too? Something like this.
sure.
But because of the question that the artists who have a different skill, like Chalerm Chai, he very skillful painter. He can master all kind of the pattern, or Thai form. And then he devote his life to master that. And then suddenly, a guy who just cooking and serving food in a gallery and then called himself like a master, became like popular in the Western world. And for him, he devotes his life so hard and then go to nowhere. He never even recognized internationally. This is, it's still a big question. He is still known among local Thai. What about international, art scene? Nothing. This is the dilemma of the art world.
Yeah, it's the dilemma of the Western art world. I do think, though, that Rikrit, You have to have been there. I think that's probably the answer with Rikrit. New York in the late 80s and 90s had its own scene, and I can see that something like that, Rikrit cooking food in the gallery, in a sense, it is interesting. It's not interesting for that long, and it's not about Thailand. I think that's the key thing here. The action of cooking something in a gallery for curious New Yorkers is not actually anything to do with Thailand. It's everything to do with New York in the late 80s. And so great, fine, fair enough. And it made Rikrit's career and it made Boryo's career as well. So a bunch of people were... But your question is, indeed, is that, what is art? So I think that's what we get to.
So that's why the art today, you need a lot of explanation. Yes, exactly. You need an explanation. It means you need a theory to explain why this art is art, right? An artist who train so hard to become a master, and then live in the other periods, not in today world. This is something that we should realize that.
Yeah, but you still probably need explanation to figure out why this is art for many people. Many people will look at this and not necessarily get why this is important and beautiful. I say this is beautiful, but I'm pretty sure my grandmother doesn't think this is beautiful.
So what I'm saying that's why this book is important. Why? You need that. You need people like her. Exactly. That's why, otherwise, people, they just pass by. But we need this book.
I would say because in the case of Thailand, because we are still, in a way, kind of like being, not in terms of censor, but it's like we has been kind of like chosen what you need to know, or what you should know, or what you need to know. Yes. So all this kind of picture will never be printed or published in a historical book where we would learn at school. It's like when Suti been doing the history class and have all these images carved on the table. The reason that he shows on this, like this that Pimani has been using it is because it's never shown in a formal educational, textbooks. So where would you learn about this? This kind of narrative or history. And so, it has been already chosen and determined by some rulers or, political powers, what you should know or what you don't need to know. That's why it's really important to have an artist who can kind of like dig out in a way and, taken out some of those unseen or unchosen, or, to be able to kind of like convey or make out another public narrative. It's an option. Yeah.
Sure. So that is why your friend in Chiang Mai, who's very skilled, because skill ultimately is skill. It's not intellectual. And great art is often intellectual. Even the masters, the Renaissance masters, ultimately they were dealing with ideas, even though skill was clearly more important than it is perhaps today. And so these occluded histories, and the book is full of these kinds of images from throughout Asia, Southeast Asia. And you guys didn't know each other. I mean, this is the interesting thing, that you didn't know these artists when you started making work. You'd never seen artworks from the 70s by Harsono and all these people. No. And yet, so you see that the same ideas were driving the artists. How do I make art about something real that is also has some extra thing in it? Because otherwise it's a piece of journalism. A lot of artworks today are called archival art, and they're just an archive. And you could get that from a report, like a journalistic report. You don't need an artist. Where you need the artist is that this image becomes indelible. And the meaning of this image beyond the event in 1976 starts to percolate. That's what an artist does, a good artist, a great artist. So with all due respect to your friend in Chiang Mai, he's a skilled guy, but his images don't really make you think about anything. So I think it's that extra thing. And I think the true postmodern, if we talk in those terms, but I think no one talks about postmodern anymore, is this business of integrating the audience into the artwork and not having this divide, not having this static object which you look at and own. It's the thing where you develop this conversation and the audience becomes active. So these works make you active. Rickrett's dinner party in New York doesn't really make you active except for one night. That's it. And beyond that, you're not really going to necessarily think about much. But, and your friend in Chiang Mai, the work won't make you active as a viewer. I don't think so. So I think this is what, going back to the topic, this is why these works travel. Because audiences everywhere are activated by them. And particularly if, as you describe, it's about power, it's about people, it's about the state, it's about injustice, it's about things that everyone understands and unfortunately has experienced. And the skill here is that even though it's Thai, it's universal in its reach.
Yes, I think it's like this is the role of art, is offer another narrative, another reading that the audience has to form that by themselves through this participative kind of action, either within like participating as an active player within the environment of the art settings or the reading itself, that this is not one layer because it's the photographs and with the artist's kind of like intervention within the photos. There could be so many readings about this one. And it's, also, going back to this kind of performatives expression as well, because it started with one of the students doing performance, right, about this someone who looks like one of the monarchy was hanging on a tree. That led to this very dramatic scene. No one was ever thought that it would lead to this, point. So in a way, it's really, really touching and violent at the same time. There's so many layers about these photos and this your work, yeah. And talk about like materialism, the value of today versus the value of yesterday. Yeah.
I think when I create this series, I just want to show the hidden photograph, from the incident. How can I make people memorize this instead of just like forget it? So that's why, and I want it to be contemporary. It means that I have to add up some today, or something that about today. That's why I insert, I superimpose my pink man on that, because of I'm playing about criticizing about the consumerism, because of today we enjoy to enjoy consuming because of we have the freedom to do that. So that's why I put him in this the horror. This kind of the very brutal photograph.
Yeah, I think, and if you talk about language of art, what you're describing, the essence of what you're describing is incongruity. And virtually everything that I was discussing earlier has that component. So that contradiction between either materials or iconography, image, it makes you uncomfortable. It's the incongruity of this pink man, lightweight, silly shopping person with a cart in the middle of a massacre. But so many of the other images, Suti's desks in the middle of the street, no schoolroom is set up in the middle of the street. So there's an incongruity there. But then you always still go back to basic aesthetics. In this case, the visuals are very striking. Black, white, gray, bright pink. That's a classic, attractive palette. Similarly, Suti's works, the engravings are beautiful. They're very technical. You're talking about technique. They're beautifully made, with pure technical. The concept is super strong, but also the classic beauty. So if we're talking about things that endure, I do think incongruity endures. That confrontation of things that make you uncomfortable, that's an enduring feature that doesn't really wear out over time. But also beauty in the classical way also endures and translates. And I would add one thing about the audience and making people work. I think that's one of the things that the Asians do and that they did ahead, is that these works make you, the audience, do something, work. You cannot sit there and be passive. And I think that's the added thing. And that's maybe one of the reasons these pieces translate over time and space, is that ultimately, if you're engaged, you contribute. And therefore, it's the artwork is always alive and always keeps its voice. It never is passive. Does that make sense as an artist?
Yeah, that's what I was expecting.
Good.
Because of, like many artists, that when you produce work, you hope your work means something, do something, contribute something to the society, particularly this photograph, I somehow I made a film called, the title is Shakespeare Must Die. Adopt this scene, part of in a movie, and that my movie was banned by the government. It just was the ban was lifted just early this year, but it was banned 12 years ago. This work produced in 2001. My feature film produced in 2012, and you see, even 2012, this kind of let's say the incident never feel comfortable for the authority. Authority try to not, when they see that, you imitate that scene, so we have to ban it. And I say, why you want to ban my film? Because I just, inspired by the picture, the photograph, and I'm not really dealing about the 6th October, the actual scene. But they say, no, this is taboo. This is something, no, you can't do this. I say people can Google and you can watch on the, YouTube, and the scene, the violent scene, you can watch on the YouTube. Why don't you want to ban my film? And my film only show in the theater, and then people have to buy the ticket to see the violence. Why you have to ban? And the authority cannot. They just say ban. And then I go to the court. I took this case to the court, and I fought for 12 years. And finally, the Supreme Court uplift the ban. and the authority have to pay me the compensation, and that's why nowadays no ban because of my case. Nobody want to face the same, this kind of the problem because of today Thailand have one law that they punish the authority if they abuse the power. It means that my case, when the court order that the compensation, the money have to come from the officer who ordered the ban. Even though you retire, they run after them to get the money back and pay me. They already advanced the money to me, so then the job is for them to search out who ordered the ban. And today, in the censorship committee, they say no ban. You can keep the heart rate like 20 plus. Okay, do that. Don't ban. I don't want to pay. So this is because of we have to fight for our freedom of expression. That the court give the reason right. The authority abused my freedom of expression. This is the job of the artist to fight for the freedom. This is the consequence. If you do something like this, what I did, I have to face it, to confront it. You Google Cinema Oasis and then you will see the program. Yep, it's still on. You can check the program.
Do you think it was only because of this? Surely there were other reasons why the film was banned.
Actually, from my understanding, they have other agenda, but they use this kind of.
They use this.
They use this kind of photograph as an excuse because they can't even charge me directly like, oh, you are. Maybe you might have other implication like criticizing the monarchy or something like that, because it's not so obvious. Like what you say that we make art that under something like very not so so clear. So everything have to be ambiguous. You don't want to make everything so clear. And also because of by doing this, it gives you many way of interpretation. I think this is important. You have to have the work has to be open end. The artwork has to be open end. You don't want to like, okay, this is. I think that's what the good art is about. That is open for interpretation. Let the audience to interpret.
Take questions? Yeah. Yeah, anyone with questions, remarks, or whatever? I think this is all very informal, so.
Have been so successful.
The film has been banned for how many years?
12 years. 12 years. I know it's not good. For me is, we lost 12 years of the opportunity. The thing is, for instance, there is another film, that I also part of the film. Part of a producer. It's called Dog God. This is also my partner, my wife, Inke. She a director. And this film was banned 25 years. And you know what's happened? When the film released, the critics say we have lost the opportunity that to see the good film at that time, at the moment. And the thing is, when the film came out in, let's say in 1998, at that time, Thailand had like a new kind of new film, but this film already got banned. It means that instead of have another film that to create another dialogue, another kind of like how you call make the kind of movement, you know, and the society have lost the opportunity because the band is not even help. Even okay, make the artist like, oh, okay, you are known about the band. I mean, I know it's not fun because when you fight and you fight lonely, you know, and 12 years in the court, you have to explain to the court that, oh, this is abuse of, you know, power by authority. And, you know, when it came out, we already lost the momentum.
I get you. One question I was wondering is, your work, especially this work, has traveled internationally. Has there been different reactions or particular reactions in different kinds of the world that you remember of?
There's a Thai in the Thai audience. Thai audience can put a note on comment that when he first saw this work, and because he came from the October generation from the photograph, and he get upset that I put this pink man make fun of this photo, and he say that this is disrespect to the hero, you know, who sacrificed their life. And when he learned about my intention that, but because of, you know why I put this man on this, because of today nobody care that who died for democracy. And that's why I want them to realize that the guy who didn't care what's going on, just make fun about the violence, the people who vote for the governor, at that time the governor of Bangkok, that who won the election, he the one who support the massacre. And how come the Bangkok people who passed that experience, you know, the violence, and then support them and vote for the governor who pro the massacre. This is insane. This is I mean, for me, this is for me. I can't believe that. But what's something wrong? That's why my question is about the history and our memory, and that's why I made this series. And from this, if you look for other different photo from the same series, you will see the one of the guy who put the stick on the dead cop, dead student. And when you look at that, you look and you read the photograph, it looked like this kind of, the people who try to, you know, kill the vampire or something like that. You know, you put a stick on because they believe that the student, have some kind of the curse or some vampire or something, very bad spirit. You know, dominate them. You need to chase them out by put a stick on. That's why they put a stick on, because only this. And this, if you look at this photograph, this is, if you know the American in the early 20th century, you will see that the tree in the U.S., many trees hang the black people. That's why they have the song that why, the strange tree that, the flute is, the black man hang out. And that is the black music. When I listen to that and I look at the photograph, oh, some kind of, similar thing. And that is why the violin, if you study the violin, they somehow have the same pattern in many corners of the world. When I work at this, I also have to know the violin, learn about the violin. The artists have to learn about the violin to understand what kind of the violin that we facing, and like today that when we listen Mr. Trump talking about something on television that I got shocked, but we never learn anything, and we want, another war, another violin, and this is our duty that we have to face this kind of, the guy who what they call, one of the professor called, this is an evil. This is not just like a stupid guy. Something like this.
He's after Greenland, not yet after Thailand.
Yeah, so the importance of these works for this moment. I was trying to avoid that name, that particular name. Maybe we wrap it up. No other questions? Yeah. Okay.
Well, on the last thing you mentioned about evil, and sometimes we have to deal with those people, demon, or maybe even more like, so cruel thing. But we need to find ways and bypass, and also we have to create the, positive atmospheres and that's to survive and thrive. How do you see those aspects on the society? How we can bypass and overcome with our positive energy or something to be better world? Don't know.
How to overcome evil with great difficulty, I think, at this moment. But
I think maybe this part of the world, it's always like the world is composed of the two energy, That's why to push the world, move forward. So the bad energy is also, we need the bad energy. It's a circle, so you have to move around, But the problem how we keep the balance. This is our duty. How we keep the balance. If we off the balance, it means that we want off, So it's our duty. We cannot get rid of this, demon, because they pass apart. We also have a demon in ourselves. So how we keep our balance, that's the key.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone to join this activity today. Before you leave, please take a moment to complete the questionnaire, please. Thank you.
Yeah, so apparently I'm being asked to say where to get the book if those who want the book. You have to order it at Kinokuniya, Bangkok. It's on the website. You go there or you log on or something and you put your name down and you order it. It's theoretically available, and I guess if you put your name down and probably pay ahead, they bring it. It's distributed by Taylor Francis in Asia. Or you can order it direct from the UK publisher, which they send it within 2 days. And I think it costs in the UK, it's £45, but I think you can get it discounted. And then the shipping is This is very prosaic. Huh? Shipping is apparently 20 pounds. There you go.